Have you ever been pushed to the edge, only to find that standing your ground is the hardest fight of all? This is the story of Lila Brooks, a woman who faced unprovoked racism and violence in a simple parking lot dispute. What happened next is a powerful reminder of how one moment of courage can change everything. Stay tuned to hear how Lila fought back, not just for herself, but for the right to be treated with dignity and respect. The evening air was unusually warm for late spring, the sun's last golden rays spilling over the quiet streets of Sycamore Heights. As Lila Brooks, her name now, a symbol of resilience, finished her long shift at the local diner, the weight of fatigue pressed heavily on her shoulders. The evening had felt endless, the minutes crawling by, each customer more demanding than the last. Yet, she endured. She always did. Her car was parked in the distant lot behind the diner, nestled at the edge of a small strip mall just off Meadowbrook Drive. Lila's mind was already on her next stop, the grocery store, just a few blocks away. She had the list memorized: bread, milk, eggs, and a few other necessities to get her through the week. It wasn't much, but it was her routine, a small comfort after a long workday. She slipped into her car with a sigh of relief, the worn seat hugging her as she started the engine. The drive to the supermarket was a short one, but the lot was always packed, especially on weekends. Lila circled for a while, trying to find a spot close to the entrance. Finally, she spotted an opening near the front of the store. It was a good spot, not too close to the entrance, but just far enough to give her peace. She guided her car smoothly into the space, aligning it with the lines as she always did. Before she could even open her door, however, the shrill sound of screeching tires tore through the air. A large, gleaming white SUV shot into the spot next to her, coming to an abrupt halt just inches away. Lila's heart skipped a beat as she glanced at the driver. A middle-aged man with a stiff, impatient demeanor scowled from behind the wheel, his face flushed red. His eyes locked onto hers, brimming with an unsettling anger that seemed to linger in the air between them. Without a word, he threw open his door, nearly slamming it into her vehicle. He stepped out, his gait stiff and purposeful, like a man with something to prove. His sharp, accusatory voice cut through the quiet evening. "That spot was mine," he barked, his face contorted in frustration. Lila froze, caught off guard by his aggression. For a moment, she simply stared at him, unsure of how to respond. The words were harsh, full of entitlement, and his body language made it clear that he expected her to apologize. He wasn't just angry, he was furious, as though he had every right to be. Her pride, her dignity, everything she had fought for in her life, wasn't this what he wanted to take from her? He stepped back, smirking as though he had won some kind of twisted victory. To him, she was nothing but someone who deserved this treatment. The anger rose like a wave inside Lila. Her breath quickened, her hand shaking, and before she could think, she raised her hand and slapped him back. It wasn't as hard as his hit, but it was enough. Enough to show him that she wouldn't take this lying down, that she wouldn't be his victim. For a moment, the world stood still. The man's eyes widened in shock, his face registering disbelief. He staggered back, his mouth agape as the crowd around them began to murmur. Phones appeared in the hands of onlookers, some recording the scene, others simply watching in stunned silence. He spat out curses, his face contorted in rage. "How dare you hit me?" His voice trembled with fury, and for the first time, Lila saw the flicker of fear in his eyes. She stood her ground, heart pounding, but her body rigid with defiance. She wasn't backing down. The man continued to shout, but Lila was already walking away, her mind clouded with thoughts of the insult, the slap, the hate in his eyes. She didn't want to be here anymore. She didn't want to give him the power to ruin her day, to ruin her peace. But as she reached the door to the store, something caught her eye, something that made her heart sink into her stomach. Deep scratches marred the side of her car, the silver paint scraped away as though someone had taken a sharp object and dragged it across her vehicle. Her chest tightened as the truth hit her. It wasn't just about a parking spot. It wasn't just about the slap. This was vandalism. This was personal. The man, still sitting in his SUV, glanced over at her with a smug smile, as if enjoying her distress. He made no move to hide the satisfaction in his gaze, as though he had won some victory. Lila's hands clenched into fists at her sides. She wanted to scream, to cry. But she didn't. Instead, she pulled out her phone, dialing the police with steady fingers. Lila's voice was steady, though a storm of emotions raged within her. The operator's calm voice on the other end of the line did little to ease the heaviness in her chest as she explained the situation. "I was just in the parking lot, and a man approached me," she said, her words clear but her pulse still racing. "He became aggressive, insulted me, and slapped me. When I went to leave, I noticed my car had been scratched, deliberately. I need help." She gave the operator her location, describing the vehicle and the man who had caused the trouble. As she ended the call, Lila glanced toward the SUV where the man still sat, his eyes locked onto hers. His expression was smug, almost as if he expected no consequences for his actions. The man didn't move, didn't show any sign of guilt or remorse. Lila felt her stomach churn, but she squared her shoulders and took a deep breath. This wasn't just about her car. This was about something much larger. The slap had stung, but the words, the venomous things he had said, left a deeper mark on her soul. She refused to let it slide. The minutes felt like hours. People around her were still watching, some whispering among themselves, others pretending to be too busy to notice. But she could feel the weight of their eyes, the judgment in the air. She had no illusions about what they were thinking. Some might feel sorry for her, others might even blame her for escalating the situation. After all, who could believe that such a thing could happen in a quiet town like Sycamore Heights? And yet it had. And now, she was standing in the midst of it, waiting for the authorities to show up, to make this man accountable. The sound of sirens in the distance brought a sense of calm. They were a symbol of justice, of protection, but also of something more. A promise that she wouldn't be left to face this alone. When the first squad car rolled into the lot, her chest relaxed just slightly. She could already see the officers' eyes scanning the scene, assessing the situation. They were professionals, and she trusted them to see the truth of what had happened. The officers stepped out of their cars, moving towards her, their boots heavy on the pavement. Lila didn't flinch when they approached. Instead, she straightened her back and met their gaze. One officer, a woman in her late 30s, nodded as she introduced herself. "I'm Officer Anderson," she said. "We'll take it from here. Tell me what happened." Lila briefly recounted everything, the man's approach, his insults, the slap, and the damage to her car. She didn't leave anything out, even the deep humiliation she felt. The officer listened intently, taking notes as Lila spoke, her expression softening with empathy. After Lila finished, Officer Anderson turned toward the SUV, her eyes narrowing as she assessed the situation. The man was still sitting inside, his arms crossed over his chest, looking not at all concerned. He didn't even try to act surprised by the presence of the police. His indifference was chilling. One officer walked toward him, while the other continued to ask Lila a few more questions, confirming details of the confrontation. "Where exactly did the man strike you?" Officer Anderson asked. Lila touched her cheek gingerly, wincing as she recalled the pain of the slap. "Right here," she said, pointing to the side of her face. "It was sudden, he just slapped me without warning. And then, when I turned to leave, I saw the scratches on my car." The officer nodded. "We'll get it all sorted out," she reassured Lila. "Stay here." Lila watched as Officer Anderson approached the man, her movements measured, professional. But as the officer spoke to the man, Lila could hear him yelling from a distance, his voice rising in anger. "I didn't do anything wrong," he shouted, his words spilling from his lips in a stream of agitated bluster. "She was the one who started it. She hit me first." Lila's blood boiled at his words. How dare he twist the truth so blatantly? But she held her ground, refusing to let his lies unseat the truth. She wasn't about to let him get away with making her the villain. She glanced toward the officers, hoping they could see through his facade. And then, as if reading her thoughts, one officer turned to look at her and nodded. "Don't worry," he said quietly. "We've got this." The confrontation between the officers and the man grew heated for a few more moments. Then, without warning, the officer stepped back and gestured for the man to turn around. Lila's breath caught in her chest as the man's arms were pulled behind his back, the cold sound of handcuffs snapping shut filling the air. He struggled, shouting profanities at Lila as the officers led him toward the squad car. But she stood there, unmoving, her hands clenched into fists at her sides, watching him being escorted away. The humiliation that had once gripped her was slowly being replaced by something stronger, empowerment. Justice had been served, at least for now. Her body still felt tense with the memory of the encounter, but the relief that flooded her chest was undeniable. The officers finished their task, exchanging a few words between themselves as they prepared to leave the scene. One of them walked over to Lila. "We have enough evidence to move forward with the case," he said, offering a reassuring smile. "Would you like to file a formal complaint?" Lila nodded, her throat tight. "Yes. I need to make sure this doesn't go unnoticed. He can't get away with it." The officer handed her a card with the case number and his contact details. "If you need anything, don't hesitate to reach out. We'll handle it from here." As the officers drove away, taking the man in the back of the squad car, Lila stood there for a moment longer, letting the calm settle around her. She had taken a stand. She had faced the truth, and now it was out of her hands. There would be paperwork, maybe more confrontation, but the truth was on her side. Yet as she walked back to her car, the heaviness in her chest remained. She couldn't ignore the thought that the man's actions, his hatred, would haunt her for much longer than she wanted. The physical pain of the slap would eventually fade, but the emotional scars would take time to heal. Lila took a deep breath, looking at her car once more. The scratches on the side, although repaired, were a painful reminder of the hostility she had faced. The sting of the slap had dulled, but the words, his words, lingered, echoing in her mind. "You people." She felt that phrase burn through her chest again, like acid. It wasn't just about the parking spot. It wasn't just about the slap. It was about how she was treated because of the color of her skin. As Lila drove away from the scene, the police sirens still ringing in her ears, a heavy sense of unease followed her. It wasn't relief. Not yet. The day's events weren't over, and the shadows of the encounter followed her every turn. It wasn't just about a man in a parking lot. It was about a cycle, a pattern that had existed for far too long. She pulled into her apartment complex, the familiar sight of her building offering little comfort. Lila parked her car and sat there for a few moments, the engine still running, staring out at the quiet lot. She let the thoughts swirl in her head. The slap, the damage to her car, the man's smugness, it all felt like an assault on her very existence. As much as she wanted to push the incident to the back of her mind, she knew she couldn't. Not this time. This wasn't just about self-defense anymore. It was about reclaiming her dignity, her right to stand up to injustice without fear. When she finally stepped out of her car, Lila found herself walking to her apartment with an unfamiliar weight on her shoulders. She unlocked the door and entered her small, modest space, the silence enveloping her like a thick fog. Her home had always been her sanctuary, but tonight it felt different. The walls, the furniture, the quiet hum of the refrigerator, they all seemed to close in on her, like reminders of the world outside that still saw her as different. Lila sat down at the small kitchen table, her hands still trembling. The police had taken the man into custody, but she knew the battle wasn't over. She could feel the anger rising in her chest again, the injustice that hung in the air like a thick, suffocating cloud. She tried to focus on the positives. She had taken action. She had done the right thing. But the emotional toll was starting to set in. The scars weren't just physical, they were etched into her spirit. She didn't need to look at the scratches on her car to know they were a reminder of the hatred she had been forced to face. The sound of her phone buzzing broke her from her thoughts. Lila glanced at the screen, seeing a message from her best friend, Kayla. The message was simple, but it made her heart skip a beat. "Hey, I saw what happened. Are you okay?" Lila quickly typed a response. "Not really. Just a lot to process." A few seconds later, Kayla replied with something more comforting. "If you need to talk or anything, I'm here. I'm proud of you, Lila. You stood up for yourself. That takes courage." Lila smiled softly at the screen. Kayla's words meant the world to her. It was easy to feel alone in moments like these, as if the weight of the world was bearing down on her. But Kayla, along with the few close friends she had, made the burden a little lighter. They reminded her that she wasn't in this fight alone. She sent a quick reply, thanking Kayla, and then set the phone down, the silence in the room settling back in. Lila stood up, pacing the small space. She needed something to distract herself, to avoid dwelling on the darkness that threatened to overwhelm her. The TV remained off, as always. It wasn't just the noise, it was the images, the stories of injustice and hate that were replayed so often. It was easier to remain silent, to not let the world intrude on her personal space. Instead, she turned to the small stack of books on her shelf. She'd always found comfort in reading. As her fingers ran over the spines of the books, her mind drifted back to the trial. She couldn't stop thinking about what was to come. The man might try to deny everything, twist the facts, manipulate the truth. But now that the police had taken the first steps, there was no going back. The next morning, Lila woke early, as she always did. The sun was barely up, casting long shadows across her apartment. Her mind was already racing with the events of the previous day, the parking lot confrontation, the slap, the vandalized car, and now, the impending legal battle. She couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just about this one man anymore. It was about the bigger fight. She had grown up knowing that people like him existed, the ones who saw her as less than human, simply because of the way she looked. She had faced it in subtle ways, in the quiet whispers and the sideways glances, but nothing like this. What had started as a petty dispute over a parking spot had become a full-fledged battle for respect. Lila stood in front of the mirror, applying makeup, though it was more out of habit than any real desire to look different. She felt raw, exposed, but she couldn't let anyone see it. Not yet. Not when she had so much to prove. The day ahead would bring meetings with her lawyer, more paperwork, more preparations. But it would also bring more confrontation, more people trying to twist the truth. She had to be ready. The drive to the police station was quiet, the city streets slowly waking up as people headed to work. Lila's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, her thoughts swirling. She didn't want to think about it too much, but she couldn't help it. This man, this stranger who had made her feel small and insignificant, had hurt her in ways that were difficult to quantify. But she wasn't going to let it end there. The legal process would take time, but she was determined to see it through. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for every person who had ever been made to feel inferior because of who they were. When she arrived at the police station, the familiar hum of activity around her felt strangely comforting. Officers moved quickly and purposefully, each one absorbed in their own work, but she couldn't ignore the sense of urgency that had replaced the calm she once felt here. The case was growing, and with it, the weight of the situation. Lila walked up to the counter and spoke briefly with one of the officers before being led to a small room. Her lawyer, Maria Lopez, was already waiting for her, sitting at the table, flipping through a file. "Good morning, Lila," Maria said, offering her a warm smile. "I've spoken with the prosecutor. They're confident about the evidence we've gathered so far. It's in our favor, but we have to be prepared for anything. You've done well so far. We just need to keep our focus." Lila nodded, her anxiety rising once more. The fight had only just begun, but she was determined to stay in control. "I'm ready," Lila said, her voice firm, though she could feel the doubt creeping in at the edges. Ready for what? She thought, but forced the thought aside. She couldn't afford to think like that. As she sat down across from Maria, she felt the heaviness of the case settling in. The words she had spoken yesterday, the reports filed, the evidence gathered, it all seemed like small pieces in a much larger puzzle. And Lila was the one putting it together. As the hours stretched on at the police station, Lila felt the weight of the world pressing down on her. Her lawyer, Maria, had been thorough, walking her through every aspect of the case. They reviewed the incident from every angle, Lila's calm response, the man's aggressive escalation, the slap, and finally, the damage to her car. Maria had secured the footage from the supermarket security cameras, which would be pivotal in proving Lila's case. The recordings clearly showed the man's approach, his insults, and, most importantly, the slap that had been delivered without provocation. Lila had tried to keep her composure, tried to walk away, but the footage was undeniable. It painted a vivid picture of what had happened. But Lila knew that didn't guarantee a win in the courtroom. The man might deny everything, twist the facts, and try to paint her as the aggressor. The thought made her stomach turn. As she left the police station that afternoon, Lila felt a strange mix of relief and apprehension. There was still so much left to unfold. As much as she wanted to put the ordeal behind her, she knew it would follow her for a long time. The man, who had now been identified as Gregory Halston, was no longer a faceless antagonist. His name was out there now, tied to the incident, but Lila also knew that he would likely fight back, fiercely, and with whatever resources he could muster. That night, as she returned to her apartment, Lila couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. Her phone buzzed with another message from Kayla, this time with a link to a local news story. The headline read, "Local woman claims racial assault in parking lot incident." The article was brief, but it featured Lila's name and some of the details of the altercation. It also included a quote from Gregory Halston's lawyer, who painted a very different picture of events. He was simply defending himself after being aggressively confronted by the woman, the lawyer had said. There was no unprovoked assault. This is all a misunderstanding. Lila's breath caught as she read the words. It felt like a slap all over again. His lawyer was already working to rewrite the story, to turn the tables on her. It was disheartening, but not surprising. People like Gregory, privileged, entitled, were so used to shifting the narrative in their favor. He would try to make her look like the villain, to paint her as the one who started the conflict. Lila set the phone down and sat in silence for a long time. The weight of the world felt heavier in that moment. She had never imagined that something as mundane as a parking space could turn into a battle for her dignity, for her place in the world. She had done nothing wrong. She had tried to keep her composure, to avoid escalating the situation. But here she was, forced to defend herself in ways she hadn't prepared for. The next few days were a blur of legal meetings, phone calls, and briefings from Maria. The evidence was strong, but it was hard to ignore the whispers in the media, the way Gregory's defense was already shaping the narrative. People were starting to pick sides, and Lila could feel the divide widening. Some believed her, some didn't. The subtle, insidious racism that had been a part of her life since childhood had never been so visible, so blatant. And she wasn't sure how to combat it. In the midst of the uncertainty, Maria stood firm beside her, constantly reassuring Lila that they were on the right path. We have the footage. We have the witnesses. We have the truth, Maria told her repeatedly. But each time, the doubts crept back in. What if it wasn't enough? What if Gregory's privilege was enough to override the truth? Her heart pounded as the video footage was played once again, the images on the screen stark and undeniable. Gregory's angry face, the way he had stormed up to her car, the moment he slapped her, and then the scratches on her vehicle. The footage spoke louder than any words could, and Lila felt a sense of relief wash over her as she watched the man's actions laid bare for the jury to see. But even with the evidence, even with the weight of everything she had endured, doubt still nagged at the back of her mind. Would they believe her? Would they see her as a victim, or would they let Gregory's privilege sway the outcome? The trial continued through the day, with each side presenting its case. Lila felt exhausted, emotionally drained by the constant barrage of lies and manipulation. She hadn't expected the process to be easy, but the way her truth was being questioned, twisted, was still hard to bear. The final statements came, and Lila found herself holding her breath as Maria stood before the jury one last time. Maria's voice rang out, clear and resolute. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is not just about a parking spot or a simple disagreement. This case is about respect. It's about dignity. It's about the right of every person to exist in this world without fear of being insulted, assaulted, or treated as less than human. She paused for a moment, letting her words settle in the air. Lila Brooks did nothing to deserve what happened to her. She didn't provoke the man who attacked her. She didn't ask for his disrespect. She didn't deserve the slap or the insults. She simply parked her car, and for that, she was attacked, physically and emotionally. She has done nothing but stand up for herself, for her right to exist peacefully in this world. Maria turned toward the defense, her voice sharp. And yet, in the face of this injustice, Mr. Gregory Halston has chosen to lie. To twist the truth. To make this woman the villain when, in reality, she was the victim of his hate, his prejudice. The evidence is clear. The video footage is clear. And the only thing we're left with is the truth. Mr. Halston was wrong. And he needs to be held accountable. Lila's heart swelled with hope, but there was still a nagging uncertainty. The jury would deliberate now. She couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't enough. That Gregory's wealth, his status, his ability to spin the narrative might overshadow the truth. She sat in her seat, her hands clenched, every muscle in her body tensed as the jury filed out to deliberate. The hours stretched on in silence, each minute ticking by like an eternity. Lila felt her anxiety grow with each passing second. The weight of the last few weeks, the stress of reliving the incident, all of it felt like it was bearing down on her. She didn't know how much longer she could sit there in the silence of the courtroom, waiting for a decision that would change her life forever. Finally, the door to the jury room opened, and the foreman walked in. He held the piece of paper with the verdict in his hand. Lila's breath caught in her throat, her heart pounding. This was it. The judge called the court to order, and the room fell silent as the foreman handed the paper to the clerk. Lila's hands were ice cold, her palms clammy as she gripped the arms of the chair. The clerk cleared his throat and began to read the verdict aloud. We, the jury, find the defendant, Gregory Halston, guilty of assault and property damage. Lila's breath caught in her throat. A wave of relief washed over her, followed by disbelief. She had won. The truth had prevailed. The verdict wasn't just a victory for her, it was a victory for every person who had ever been silenced, for every victim of prejudice who had fought back. But as she looked across the room at Gregory's stunned face, Lila knew the battle wasn't truly over. His arrogance, his entitlement, those things wouldn't disappear overnight. But for the first time in a long time, Lila felt the weight of her own strength. She had fought for herself, and now, she had won. The courtroom erupted into murmurs, and Lila stood up, her legs shaking beneath her. Maria smiled at her, a proud, knowing look in her eyes. You did it, she said softly. Lila felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She had fought for herself. She had stood up, and now she could finally stand tall. As she walked out of the courtroom, Lila took a deep breath, letting the cool air fill her lungs. The journey had been long, and it wasn't over yet. There would be more challenges ahead, more people who would try to silence her, more battles to fight. But for now, Lila could finally say that she had won. And in doing so, she had reclaimed her dignity, her strength, and her place in the world.